if there is a Brexit, and there can be sort of a whole spectrum of various access to the EU market that could result. So I'm going to start with one end, which is Norway, which is probably the most integrated with the European Union. And then I'm going to go to the other extreme, which is the World Trade Organization default. The UK is a member in and of itself of the World Trade Organization, and what happens if that default kicks in terms of sort of the various market access stories. So the Norway situation would be that we continue to be a member of the European Economic Area, in which case we have single market access in terms of goods as well as services. So if you wanted to continue with passporting privileges for the banking sector, I won't get too much into that detail, that would continue with the Norway option. But Norway is not part of the European Union, it's not part of the customs union. It's only a part of the free trade agreement, which means that Norway still has to comply with rules of origin requirements. It's also not part of EU's VAT cooperation. So all of these things delay and add to the trade barriers involved when Norway has to interact with the rest of the European Union. So I want to give you a couple of examples, and in fact I've just come from Oxford, where one of the people who's on the central bank board of Norway gave me a couple of examples of how those rules of origin kick in. So this person happens to own a house in France. When you order something if you wanted to order something from the rest of the European Union and get it shipped to Norway, typically that would take 2 to 3 weeks. If you ordered something from, say, a UK company, you got it shipped to Norway. If you did the same thing with France, which is exactly what this person's tried on several occasions, it takes 2 to 3 days. And her main explanation was that this is precisely because the VAT has to be paid at the border in the Norwegian case, while in the case of the UK trading with France or with other European Union members, what happens is that you can declare it as part of your domestic receipts, and it gets filed along with your domestic tax receipts. So it doesn't kick in till sort of much later that you would need to sort of prove that, yes, I've paid VAT for this. There's also the other element of it, which is rules of origin exist because the EU wants to ensure that it's not as though you're shipping goods through France simply because you want to bypass Chinese tariffs, and in principle you would have imported it yourself, had to pay tariffs, but now you're bypassing those tariff regulations by shipping them from France and then routing them into the UK. So to ensure that that's not happening and that Norway is in fact not doing that, what they have is rules of origin requirements which ensures that when a good is being shipped from China to Norway, Norway must prove when it ships that good to the UK that in fact this is a Chinese good, it's going to pay tariff on that, while if it were a Norwegian good, it would come in tariff-free. See, these rules of origin requirements, some people will tell you cost only about 8%. You can worry whether that's a small number or a big number. In my opinion, that's a gross underestimate, because what it doesn't pick up is all the small businesses which potentially are not even thinking of trading, precisely because they're so nervous about these rules of origin requirements, which put a lot of sort of regulatory and administrative burden on these exporters to be able to prove that their goods are in fact rules of origin compliant. So that's sort of one scenario where you continue to be Norway, you continue to have single market access in terms of free trade in goods as well as services, but what you lose out on is that absolute ease which comes from being an EU member, because you're part of the customs union, you don't have to comply with these rules of origin requirements. So the other thing you can think of is, well, we might not want to do a Norwegian option after Brexit because you still have to adopt 75%, Norway still adopts about 75% of the regulations from the EU without really having a voice in policy making of these regulations. So one thing you might want to do is you want to have some kind of bilateral trade deal with the EU, just the way Switzerland does. So how does that work? That is more a piecemeal type of deal, that you have a trade agreement, you go through the trade agreement, through the European Free Trade Agreement to get access to the single market in goods. You still have to agree to the free movement of people, but what you also don't get is free trade in services, which would cover the banking sector. So in principle, this is one of the reasons that you see Swiss banks locating in the UK to be able to service the European market, because they don't have that passporting privilege to the extent that the UK has. And finally, actually I should mention here that the Swiss deal is what most economists would now argue is fairly inconceivable, because in the European circles, what that's going to potentially do is create some kind of domino effect. People can start renegotiating, and that's something that the European Union wouldn't want to encourage, and therefore it's very unlikely that in fact the Swiss deal is ever going to get implemented again in the future. But putting that aside, there's also the other option, which is the other issue that with the Swiss deal, it is going to take some time. Typically, trade agreements take fairly long to negotiate. So just to give you an example, the recent EU-Korea FTA took about 15 years to in fact get implemented from the day it started. If you look at the recent sort of the US, you might argue that Korea is very different from us, so therefore it took so long, while if we were thinking of sort of more reasonable examples, it wouldn't be so bad. But the EU-Swiss agreement itself took about 10 years to finally get implemented. And if you look at the US-Canada NAFTA, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, from the day that the white paper was ready to the actual implementation took another 4 years. So these are fairly slow to come through, and which is what probably is going to happen with the UK as well, that if it tries to negotiate some kind of bilateral deal with the EU, it's going to be at least a span of 5 years, maybe even more. And the final option that I want to talk about is the World Trade Organization option. So if we don't manage any kind of post-Brexit deal with the EU, and we still want to access the single market, have free trade in goods and services and potentially everything else, the other option that's left behind is the World Trade Organization default, which is saying we would be just like Brazil or China or the US or India when trading with the European Union. So we wouldn't really get any kind of special deal there. We would just fall right into the most favored nation tariff status. And in that case, we would just sort of be trading the way any other nation that is a member of the WTO trades with the rest of the European Union. And this is the scenario that most people, that currently is being pushed as being the most likely one, because the European Union might not be willing to do a deal, and the UK might not want to do a deal if it wants to get rid of all EU regulations in principle. So this is what we would expect if, in fact, there is a Brexit, and you go to a WTO default. Our estimates for that sort of situation is that that's going to lead to at least a 3% drop in trade, at least a 3% drop in the British economy coming purely from international trade, because as trade barriers rise, we're going to see a decline in the amount of trade with the EU. So the final thing I want to talk about is what are the costs where are these sort of costs coming from? They're coming, of course, from tariff barriers, but they're also coming from missing out on future integration. So most of UK's trade surplus comes from services trade. We know services trade has a lot of non-tariff barriers, a lot of regulatory issues when you deal with other countries, when you do cross-border trade in services as opposed to cross-border trade in goods. So the tariff barriers are not that important, but here the non-tariff barriers are really important, and missing out on future services integration is going to be one of the main reasons for the losses that we would see in the British economy. And finally, what we haven't really talked about at all is investment and what happens to investments. So I can briefly mention that investments are probably what are going to see a bigger pickup, in the sense that they're going to have a bigger impact on the British economy, simply because the UK has £1 trillion in FDI stock. Those numbers are much bigger than the numbers you see for international trade. And investments are much more they're likely to move around much more than just pure trade in goods or trade in services. And one reason for that is that it might not do anything to investments that currently exist, but future inflows are going to peter out, and that would be a big loss.
When preparing for this, I was looking at some surveys conducted, including, for instance, from COADEC, which is an organization of entrepreneurs, in particular startup companies, exactly the kind of companies that we want to foster in the EU and the UK in particular. We saw that 81% of them want to stay in the EU and 19% want to leave. And why is that? Well, for the same reason, regulation. One of them, the ones who want to remain, say regulations are good, and the ones who want to leave say regulations are bad. And that sounds contradictory to me. So we have to think about what are the options after a Brexit. And I am a little bit more simplistic than the previous speaker, because I'm not an academic, if you will forgive me. And I see there's basically two options. Maybe there are intermediate options, but one is to stay within the internal market, and the other one is the Michael Gove option, which is to leave it. So the first question is, can we stay within the internal market and yet reduce or eliminate red tape? Well, we first have to look at the question, why are we in the internal market? We are, of course, in the internal market because, first of all, free movement of goods is good for the UK suppliers. You see here an economic demand and supply graph. You all know this better than I do, but it explains that if you have a tariff or if you have non-tariff barriers, you'll see supply going down and demand going down, and there will be a transfer of consumer surplus to producers, and there will be a welfare loss for society. So in order, and if we eliminate these barriers, the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers, you will see, of course, a greater consumer surplus. Everybody gains. We see the same, and by the way, this is also borne out by the facts, because having access to a tariff-free market of 500 million consumers has added at least 62 to 78 billion pounds to the UK economy per year in trade, and is responsible for about 1/8 of the UK GDP, I understand, and it's linked to 3 to 4 million jobs. So this is pretty important. These are not all going to disappear after Brexit, but nonetheless it shows you how beneficial free movement of goods is. Obviously we want free movement of services as well, and we do actually have that in spite of what the gentleman this morning explained. And the loss of these passporting rights, for instance, could have a substantial impact, for instance, on the financial sector. I will not go into that further because I think the next speaker is going to talk about banking and finance. So I will skip that. The third free movement is the freedom of establishment and the freedom of capital. That means effectively foreign direct investment. And this is very beneficial for the UK as well, as already explained. I understand that in 2014 alone, foreign direct investment from the UK was 76 billion pounds. And that more than 740 billion pounds, excuse me, is the current stock in foreign direct investment in the UK. Maybe you have a more up-to-date figure, but that's the figure that I had heard. In other words, a very, very substantial contribution to employment and to the UK economy. And these four freedoms come as a package, of course, because if you want to be in the common market, or in the internal market, it will also require free movement of persons, of workers. And these, according to an LSE study, contribute net 20 billion per year to the UK economy. So that is, it is always portrayed by the Brexiteers as a negative thing, this free movement of workers, the Polish plumber and so forth. But in reality, they make a very substantial contribution to the UK economy. Now, if we want access to the common market, that means automatically compliance with the EU regulation. I will not go through all of these various examples, but you will recognize them all, and you will also see, and it's a very basic principle, because under Article 36 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, member states are allowed to block the free importation of goods if these do not comply with national rules on public morality, policy, security, protection of health and life, national treasures or intellectual property, provided that they are not discriminatory or disguised rules, restrictions on trade. And so that means that even if you're a member of the EU, your goods can be stopped at the border for another member state if they do not comply with those national rules. So what is the best way then to guarantee national rules is to harmonize them all. This is all basic, you all know that, so I apologize for that. It's done in the form of directives, which in most cases set goals, which then it is for member states to decide how to implement them. And there can be various ways of implementing, but if you choose one way of implementing, so long as you achieve the goal, your goods can have access to the common market. Now, the EU is not only going to require that your goods comply with EU rules after Brexit, they are also going to insist that their goods are going to have access to the UK, excuse me. So it's going to be based on a principle of reciprocity. That means that we too, after a Brexit, will have to comply with EU regulations. The bottom line is that we not only, well, we can play so long as we pay, but we won't have any say even for rules in the UK. So it's a pretty bad situation to be in. Now, these rules may also come more burdensome with time. And here's a quote, by the way, from Ryanair. I'll come back to Michael O'Leary because he's a colorful character and he does interesting things. But he is a pro-EU campaigner for the simple reason that I say, and that he explains here, that it is necessary, if you want to be in the common market and the internal market, to comply with the rules. Now, over time, if we want to have access to the EU, but we don't have a say in the rules, these rules may become more burdensome. The UK has always been at the forefront of liberalisation and deregulation in the EU. We know Lord Cofield's 1992 programme, we know the rules on transport, telecom, energy, postal services, all examples of liberalisation and deregulation fostered in large part by the UK, the Netherlands and a few other countries, but the UK has always played an important role in this. And recently, Timmermans, the Vice President of the Commission, has started what he calls the Better Regulation Programme, do less and do it better. And this basically means a variety of things. First of all, whenever a regulation is adopted and the impact assessment is done, specific attention has to be paid to subsidiarity and proportionality. Subsidiarity obviously being the principle that if it can better be done at the local level, then you should leave it to the local level. If you must do it, if it can be better done at the international level, you do it at the international level. They scrutinize also existing laws and repeal or simplify them when necessary. So this already has had real impact because these are the next figures. The 2016 program is 23 new initiatives and 20 withdrawals. The 2015 was 23 new initiatives and 83 withdrawals, and the previous example was 53 new initiatives and 14 withdrawals. That's this one. So you see that trend goes further down. The EU Commission becomes very careful in the proposal of new laws. And that is in principle a good thing. But if the UK were no longer part of the EU, the Netherlands and various other countries that want to foster this better regulation program will find it more difficult to do so. So we'll see possibly more and stricter rules in the EU, and the UK will be powerless to do anything about it. So what if we go it alone? What are the effects on local firms that supply goods and services only in the UK? Well, first of all, we're not going to drop all regulation. We heard that this afternoon and this morning also. All of these rules still require solutions. These all address problems which exist even in the UK, so it serves a useful purpose. CBI, for instance, has explained that there is a lot of support for common product standards, health and safety standards and sector-wide regulation, but much less for employment rules. We had an explanation on employment law this morning, so I will not go further into that, but I will question whether the real purpose of Brexit is not to undo the social achievements and the environmental achievements that have been obtained recently. And that would be a very negative thing, I think, overall for the EU and for the UK. Now, what about firms that export to the UK, to the EU from the UK? Even if the UK is not part of the internal market, they will still have to comply with with EU rules. So they'll have double regulation. They're going to be wrapped up in red tape. And they're going to have, the only ones who will benefit from that are the likes of us, the lawyers, who will have to sort their way out of these dual and double regulation systems. So I think that is good for us and very bad for society. And we will also lose access to the trade agreements which the EU has negotiated with about 60 different countries. They may be renegotiated, but it will take substantial time, and it will not be done in time for the effects not to be felt in the EU. Now, how do international firms react to this? Well, most companies indicate that they think that they're going to reduce foreign direct investments in the UK. 72% here, 72% of investors consider access to the internal market very important. 78% consider Brexit negative for the business, and nearly half of investors, 46%, say that they would reduce investment in the UK, and 35% say that they would reduce employment in the UK. So that has potentially significant aspects in the EU. Now, one example of this is Michael O'Leary, who has previously not been a friend of the EU. He said, for instance, that the European Union spent time either suing me, torturing me, criticizing me, or condemning me. And he has compared the Commission with North Korea, for instance. At the same time, he is subtle enough and clever enough to realize that even if he doesn't like European bureaucrats, he likes being outside of the EU even less. Others who've had trouble with the EU are Microsoft, General Electric, IBM, and so forth. I can go, I have a long list here, but I won't go there. All of whom support being in the EU in spite of having had clashes with the European Commission. So a final word then on the positives. The EU membership has boosted British goods trade with other members by 55%. So to a total of 130 billion in 2013, by way of example. The LSE says that it can even be improved. Future EU reforms include particularly the completion of the internal market, whether that be through online services and online sale of goods, but also better regulation, would increase the UK's GDP by up to 7%, they estimate, nearly 1 million jobs. So that is a benefit, a real benefit that we stand to forego if we don't stay in the EU. Right now we have the best of both worlds. We have access to the EU. We have no duties, we have a say in the regulation, and we have exceptions that suit us, the Euro, Schengen, and even the exception to the ever closer Union. A final word on sovereignty. It is often said that sovereignty is a problem that's often invoked by those who favor leaving the EU. So what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is, of course, the right to legislate, to adjudicate, and to enforce. That's the definition, I'm finished. The definition of sovereignty. But sovereignty is also associated with power. And power to me means the ability to do things that you want. And there are things that you cannot do alone. Whether that is solving environmental problems, whether that is solving distortions in competition, access to foreign markets, even if you're fully sovereign, and the most sovereign nation I know is North Korea, because they fully decide what they want to do themselves, right? Even if you're fully sovereign, you cannot solve these problems like pollution and so forth. This is like a collective action problem. You need to act together in order to do things that you cannot do alone. Therefore, I feel that being a member of the EU is actually an exercise of sovereignty rather than a reduction of sovereignty. Sorry for exceeding.
I was introduced as coming from Clifford Chance. I'm Laura at Clifford Chance, and you will be unsurprised to know, getting a lot of questions from our clients about Brexit, what it might mean, what might the impacts be. We have a lot of financial services clients, but we also have a lot of corporate clients, sort of multinational corporations. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and I haven't got any slides, but I do like this one. I wish that was my slide. I wish that were my slide, but it isn't. It's the Ministry of Funny Wars, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit, so my brief is to talk about financial services, but I'm going to stray a little bit away from that brief. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the 4 modes of international trade. And that is sort of almost the programming, the code in a computer sense of a lot of what happens in the EU in terms of trade, internationally in terms of trade, for example, WTO, and in the FTA, in free trade agreements in terms of trade. So there are 4 modes of trade. The first one is cross-border. The second one is consumption abroad. The third one is the ability to establish a commercial presence in another country. And the fourth one, mode 4, often hailed as the most controversial mode, is free movement of people. Now, you'll often hear trade experts muttering about the EU-India FTA being fouled up because of problems to do with Mode 4, and it's all about Mode 4. What on earth does that mean? Well, that means that the Indian side has said, we want concessions under Mode 4, i.e. access to the EU markets to Indian professionals, otherwise we're not going to continue with these negotiations. So that's what that means. So those are the 4 modes of international trade, and we've been trying to liberalise international trade since the 1940s. The EU, in international trade terms, is quite a novel concept. And I mean novel in quite a technical sense, in that there's nothing else quite like it. And the reason for that is that it provides for the free movement of goods, services, people and capital on a cross-border basis. So if I'm a bank established in the UK, I can treat a customer in France exactly the same way as I can treat a customer in Manchester or Liverpool. And from a legal perspective, from an international trade perspective, that's actually a remarkable thing. And that's the novelty of the EU. In most other worlds, you would have to establish a separately licensed entity in the country that you were trying to provide those services in, because that country would say, well, how do I know that what those services are being properly regulated? And that's through a combination of harmonisation, of mutual recognition, so I accept that your rules are good enough to sell to my clients, and also just unilateral removal of barriers. So if you look at it from a financial services perspective, financial services institutions, banks, investment firms located in the UK take advantage of passports to passport their services to other EU member states and customers in other EU member states. And you've got the MiFID passport for investment services, which is wholesale and retail, and the wholesale and the CRD passport, which is about banking, which is wholesale and retail. So, what would happen if we were to leave? Well, at the moment, there is no provision for financial services institutions to access the single market in the same way as they do today from the UK outside of the EU. Norway does it up to a point. Financial services in Norway can, in principle, access the single market in all areas. But in financial services, it's run into a glitch because since 2010 we've invented the European Banking Authority, the European Securities and Markets Authority, the so-called ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, and the EEA agreement, which was signed in '92, doesn't provide for that because they supervise certain things directly. So things like MiFID, things like CRD4 haven't quite been applied as far as Norwegian firms are concerned. So how do you access financial services? How do UK entities access the single market after Brexit? Well, you can go for the EEA option, and that's been discussed. As I've mentioned, that's breaking down somewhat and risk becoming a rule taker, and you don't have a vote on the rules. And then you have 4 other options. You have Turkey, you have Switzerland, you have an FTA, and you have the WTO. If you're marketing goods, those 4 options have distinguishing factors that make each of the options interesting. From a financial services perspective, they could all pretty much be the same thing as far as financial services are concerned in reality. If you look at the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, and you look at what it covers for financial services, it's actually a very, very short list of stuff. You've got insurance of risks relating to shipping, commercial aviation, space launch and freight, reinsurance and retrocession, services auxiliary to insurance, transfer of financial information, financial data processing, and advisory and other auxiliary services. So no cross-border or indeed freedom of establishment, so Mode 1 or Mode 3, no cross-border or establishment rights for banks to provide services in wholesale, retail and banking. It's a very, very short list. And then if you look at a free trade agreement, if you look at one of the shiny new free trade agreements, for example, the Canadian EU trade agreement, and you look at the chapter on financial services, and you'll find pretty much exactly the same list. Free trade agreements are very good for goods, but when it comes to financial services, they follow the GATS sort of structure very, very closely. And they also have something called the prudential carve-out, and that is the right to regulate your own financial markets. So in financial services, there's not a huge amount you can do, but is all lost? Well, the answer is no, because the EU, being novel itself, is actually doing some quite novel things. It's established a system of so-called third country equivalents. So if the Commission, the European supervisory authorities, etc., and this is going to come in 2018 for MIFIR, so for wholesale investment services. And that covers a lot of the activities that happen in the UK. If the EU deems a third country, i.e. a non-EU country, equivalent, so good enough prudential conduct of business, etc., regulations, then they can deem that country equivalent and you can do cross-border in from that third country into the EU. That's unprecedented, it's quite novel, and we would have to see how that pans out. So that's going to probably come into force in 2018. Today, there isn't such a system. You have to seek separate licenses in every single country where you're looking to do business. So there are some mitigants that you could look to from a financial services perspective, sort of 2018 onwards. And I'll sort of finish on an observation about sovereignty. My sort of friend and colleague Rodri Thompson, QC at Matrix Chambers, has written a short paper on sovereignty and autonomy. And the thing is, from a legal perspective, the UK is absolutely sovereign. As a member of the EU, not as a member of the EU. There is absolutely nothing from stopping the UK from leaving the EU if it wanted to do so. There's nothing from stopping it from leaving NATO or the WTO. What these organisations provide for is a sort of voluntary binding of one's autonomy. So you can be sovereign, but you can, excuse me, bind yourself in terms of your freedom to act of action. So they're not entirely the same thing. So as my voice runs out, I think I'll take a seat.
Thank you very much.
So, 3 observations. This is a sector, an instance where EU intervention has dramatically reduced regulation. Okay? Put simply, one regulation now does exactly the same job that multiple bilateral agreements did within Europe historically. It's quite amazing. So if you ever want an example of where regulation doesn't lead to a mountain at the EU level, this is a very, very good one. I'll say a bit more about that later. It's a sector also where pooling sovereignty has had huge advantages, not only for the airlines. We've heard about Michael O'Leary already, and there's a video that I'm sorry we're going to look at where he's debating with Lord Lawson that you can Google, where he makes his case very formally. Historically, of course, as the earlier speaker said, he's criticised the EU and the Commission in particular for their state aid decisions that were effectively, I suppose, protecting Aer Lingus. But there's very little doubt, actually, that being part of this market, being part of the single market in air services, has benefited not only airlines but also consumers thinking about passenger rights and things, as well as the obvious benefits of economic regulation. The other observation is that post-Brexit obstacles are really complex. I want to make this point because this is really provoked by the often sort of very cheap and easy assumption or assertion that's made sometimes in the debates by people who say, well, you know, we'll just trade under WTO rules, we'll just negotiate free trade agreement. I want to show you, I want to illustrate exactly how difficult in this particular sector, which is an important strategic sector, those obstacles are, how complex they are, what would be involved, but also to enable us to think a bit about what Philip said, you know, how much, what the sort of trade-off between sovereignty and autonomy might be, or what the cost of independence might be. Okay, here are 4 background facts. So one of the nice features of aviation is that the EU became an actor in aviation as a result of the work of a liberal coalition. The Commission, the Netherlands, and the UK. Now, many of you in the room will be old enough to identify this person. This is the late Nicholas Ridley, famously a Eurosceptic, but also the person who identified that the best way for the UK to prosecute its policy of liberalising aviation lay through the EC competition rules. Okay? There were limitations, and there's a sort of natural laboratory experiment actually that the UK starts to try and liberalise its bilateral agreements with other member states throughout the 80s, comes across the block, realises it won't be able to do this on a very large scale, and it's Nicholas Ridley who said to his civil servants, like authored a book with the person who's actually responsible for this, to go and start trying to sort of soften up the UK's European partners, France and Germany, to persuade them that liberalisation is a good thing and that planes won't fall out of the sky. Okay. That's the coalition that moved things along. And also, given the way in which this debate has developed, it's really interesting to note that the European Court of Justice was a major actor in producing a sequence of judgments that opened up the market and made it clear that liberalisation was going to take place, despite the fact that a majority of member states were conservative and did not actually want this to take place. The second background fact is that the EU is an oasis of commercial freedom. It is a zone of liberal multilateralism in a sector which is characterised and has been so historically based on the charter that underlines all of this, which in its first Chicago Convention, which in its first article, commits itself to the absolute sovereignty of the state over the territory above its airspace. That freedom is exchanged through bilateral air services agreements, which, put simply, historically are enormously prohibitive, restrictive, and protectionist. So, quite simply, in the EU, I'll explain what the ECAA is in a moment, any airline owned or controlled by nationals of EU member states is free to operate anywhere in the EU without any kind of restrictions. This constitutes a major revolution in this sector. Okay, the ECAA essentially represents the expansion beyond the EU to a wider community. There we go, which involves these other countries, in Southwest Europe, also Norway, etc. 36 countries, 500 million consumers. All airlines can operate freely within that area. Okay. Important to know. The third background fact is that in line with the EU's exclusive competence over trade, that's a bit of a simplification, but let's leave it there for a moment. The EU's negotiated a long list of agreements with third countries. Even I got bored when I went to the page and where it showed the number of agreements by country, and you can click on the country and discover exactly what kind of agreement it is. Essentially, the EU gained competence for renegotiating all of its agreements, the agreements that our member states had with with non-member states, and inserted provisions that enabled all EU airlines to operate services, whereas historically it had only been the member states that were signatories to the agreement. Moreover, and again simplifying radically, the EU has effectively exported or applied extraterritorially its rules and standards in a whole series of areas. I can remember, for example, when I was doing interviews as part of research for a book, speaking to an official in the Commission who'd just come back from Moscow, where he'd been making sure that Aeroflot aircraft complied with EU regulations. Okay, that's just one example. There are many others. We've heard of environmental policy and security policy issues also. Okay, so 2 slides about after Brexit. One of the issues is how much of the single market would the UK want. This is partly because the thought here is that the single market gives airlines access not only to flights between countries, but among and within countries. Very important distinction. And if you press me on that, I can talk happily about 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th freedoms, but I probably won't have that pleasure this evening. The other question would be how much of the single market the EU would offer. Okay, this is a treasure. This is a real. This is a prize. Would the other member state be prepared to offer us access to it if we were to decide to Brexit? We're familiar with the Norwegian model now. It applies equally in aviation. You accept the rules and regulation of the European civil aviation area, but without any input to the standards and the economic regulation. Similarly with the Swiss model, one of the bilateral agreements that exists relates to aviation and offers mutual access for airlines of both parties and again, Switzerland has no say. So moving on to my final slide, there's also the issue of bilaterals. The UK would have to renegotiate its bilateral agreements with other aviation powers, including the larger ones, but those aren't straightforward. An air services agreement, a bilateral agreement, has the same diplomatic status as any diplomatic treaty. Okay, so this is a major undertaking which historically has taken, which historically takes years to complete, and which involves all kinds of special interests coming out and airlines effectively lobbying the governments to take the most protective approach possible. There are also the agreements with third countries. So the air services agreements with the list of countries I'm showing there all would have to be renegotiated because currently it's the EU that has they've currently negotiated at the EU level. And the UK will also need to decide whether or not it was going to replace the EU nationality clauses in its UK bilaterals. In other words, to introduce a retrospective and restrictive measure which the EU has sort of banished and not thought and really consigned to history. So what I'm showing you is a case where the UK played a major role in bringing about liberalisation, where the EU regime has set the standards, and where Brexit does confront the UK with a number of difficult and potentially unsavoury choices, which it's impossible to sort of dream or wish or assume away. Thank you.